right, it looks like we are up and running. So here at Chebacco Chat, both on Facebook Live, if you're following us there, or here on Zoom. So this week we're going to take a little bit of a different take on the Chebacco Chat, and that is to take a moment to stop and look at some of the more interesting things that have come into our collections over the last year or two. One of the most interesting of these is a donation we received from the MDI Committee for Peace. This was an organization back in the 60s, and it was a donation to us by a donor. And the documents are interesting in a number of ways, in that this organization is so obscure that even Google doesn't know about it. So it shouldn't make me this happy, but it does, that we have things in our archives and our collections that even Google doesn't know about. So yes, it's a minor thrill, but it is one of the great thrills of working in collections, is that sometimes you run into things that you would not expect to find anywhere, and that really have not been worked with in any real way in, well, pretty much ever. So the plan for today is to take a look at some of the more interesting documents in this series of collections, to take a look at this 1960s period here on MDI. As on MDI, we tend to be a little bit distant from some of the other things going on in the world. So when we think of the civil rights movements, for example, we don't think of MDI. We tend to think of places like Selma or Montgomery or the March on Washington, D.C. Or when we think of anti-war activism against Vietnam, we think of places like a San Francisco or somewhere like that, not MDI. But what we find in this collection and through these documents is that even here on MDI out here in Maine, there were a number of people who were deeply connected to these larger movements, and that these larger movements had a direct impact on the daily lives of people here. So we'll go ahead and share a screen over. So taking a look at MDI Committee for Peace, and we'll give it a sec, wait for Google to catch up. So the first set of documents that I picked out is from the real organizations that are starting to come together in the early 60s. So this is called at first the Civil Rights Committee of the larger MDI Committee for Peace. And 1964, of course, is a very important year in the civil rights movement. And a number of citizens on MDI decided to come together in order to advocate for the cause of civil rights. So here is their part of their organizing documents of who's involved and what it is that they are trying to achieve as a group. So we see at first a civil rights statement that they believe in equal rights for all. In 2021, that would go without saying. In 64, that is a little bit more radical of a stance. So they commit themselves to education, to information, to fundraising. And here's a list of people that are on the various committees. So some of these will be pretty familiar names to island historians, but there are a couple of things that really stood out here for me. The first is that it's pretty remarkable how many women are involved in this organizational effort. Because when we think of civil rights efforts at this time, we tend not to think of women as being as active of participants as they truly were. So taking a look at civil rights, The involvement of women is very important, and we see that reflected here in their committee structure and in who's involved in this effort. The second thing that really stood out for me is the number of ministers involved. Because as you look through this list, you see a lot of people who are, Father so and so, or ministers, or reverends. And to me, that's a really interesting collection of people here. Because again, clergy as civil rights activists are really not something that you would think would go together in quite the way that we are seeing here. To the side, over on the committee side, you'll see those numbers in parentheses. Those are their phone numbers. So kind of an interesting thing there. But this is a coalition of people coming together for a particular purpose, and that is to advocate for civil rights for their fellow citizens. Now, as you might imagine, this draws some interesting people who look to the committee for potential support. And to me, this is one of the most interesting and perhaps most significant documents in the entire collection, as this is a letter from Martin Luther King Jr. Now, granted, it's probably a mass-produced letter and a form letter to a degree, but this is a really interesting find because it really gives us a snapshot not only into what is happening in 1965, but also of the role that groups like the Committee for Civil Rights and the MDI Committee for Peace would play in advocating for civil rights for all Americans. So you'll notice some of the language is quite interesting. In 2021, saying something like the Negro vote would raise some eyebrows, to say the least. But this gives us a sense of how people in 1965 would have looked at these questions. So what is Dr. King asking for support for? Remember, at this time, we are just on the cusp of some of the great segregation battles. In theory, segregation had been illegal since 1954. In practice, that's perhaps not the case. And we see a number of battles over segregation and that idea of separate being equal. They're still fighting that. So he's asking for help to help combat that and to help for political change. Now, as he puts it in point 2, forward-looking, decent-minded men, Negro and white, thinking of a biracial alliance. But it is interesting that he puts it in terms of decent-minded men. If we think back to the last document we looked at, many of the organizers that we see in the Committee for Peace are women. So an interesting set of underlying expectations and ideas behind that. The organizations he is working for is the SCLC, so Southern Christian Leadership Conference, all doing their part in order to try to advance this fight. But it is that direct connection between people here on the island and those larger, broader affairs that we think of in Alabama and in other places. Attached to that letter was this. So a solicitation and donation envelope. So in and of itself, this is going to be pretty common and typical. There is a certain interesting element to it here, though. So if we look at the front side of the envelope, it looks like business reply mail, pretty straightforward. But the inside of the envelope is particularly interesting to me as a historian. It's asking for contributions, but inside the envelope, it contains a sentence. I suggest you send your appeal to the following persons without mentioning my name. And I've been mulling over this envelope for several days, trying to figure out what without mentioning my name here means. Part of me thinks that this is potentially just the standard disclaimer that comes with a solicitation that, please don't involve my name with solicitation efforts. That's possible. But in the context of what they are raising money for, that civil rights movement and the very contentious nature of it, maybe there's something a little bit deeper about not wanting to attach a name to it. So, a potential interesting question there that I'm not sure that I have an answer to yet, or that I haven't quite figured out yet. But is it possible that some advocates that might support civil rights just do not wish to be named to their friends and to whoever else they would recommend to support this cause? So, in 2021, that sounds very jaded. In the context of 1964, perhaps there's something to that. One of the other major movements, and really the guiding force for the Committee for Peace, is the situation in Vietnam. So, in hindsight, we're very familiar with the story of gradually escalating tensions, a massively destructive war that splits America in two between those that supported the effort and those that did not, and really a legacy that remains with the United States in some ways even to the present day. These divisions are apparent even in the early 1960s. And we see that in some of the papers within the collection from the MDI Committee for Peace. Now, as you might suspect from the name and the title, they are advocating for peace. And we'll see that in terms of nuclear disarmament and fighting nuclear testing. We'll see that in advocacy against expanding the war in Vietnam. We even see a couple of documents that draw Kennedy's decisions relating to Cuba and the Cuban Missile Crisis into very serious question. So these are a couple of the more interesting documents. Over on our left, we have a howitzer in the middle of a field. It's beautiful, but we were hoping for a plow. So sort of a pithy way of putting forward the idea that in Vietnam, if we look at it from the perspective of the Vietnamese people, they're not really particularly interested in part two of the Vietnam War. Part one being against the French, and that ends in 1954. Part two with the United States. Popular support for the Southern Vietnamese regime and for American involvement tended to be very low. And what most people at the time would have been interested in was trying to rebuild from the war that already happened. These wars were tremendously expensive. Some of the documents go into the cost of keeping just a handful of bombers in action, and it ran into the millions of dollars. Here we have a suggestion. Well, we were really hoping for a plow. Over on our right, we have a cartoon. This is from one of the newspapers that we see in the collection. And we have Lbj dressed up as Uncle Sam with a gag on, which is kind of an interesting visual image, as he was well known for being able to talk and talk and talk. And the sign on it is that we want you for whatever it is we're fixing to do in Vietnam. As in 64 and 65, that isn't clear. Not only is there not really a clear plan, but there's not really a clear rationale that we see. Now, this is a conflict that starts playing out in the American media, but this is towards the origins of that. So groups like the Committees for Peace and so forth, and other groups like the Women's Strike for Peace, which was a different group but had connections with the MDI Committee for Peace, draw attention from other governmental officials. So the Committee on Un-American Activities, most famous for Joseph McCarthy and McCarthyism earlier in the 50s, well, they're still in business. That was still a standing committee of the United States Congress. And this is one of the hearings that they're having, is on un-American activities related to advocating for peace. So 1962, it's a little bit of an earlier document, but the very direct statement here is that people who are advocating for peace are really fronts for communists. So this is right at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Vietnam is slowly starting to escalate. And we see here this idea that the House Un-American Activities Committee is going to be looking at peace advocacy groups because advocating for peace cannot be a genuine desire, or even if it is a genuine desire, that it is really serving the interest of international communism. Now, whether that is an actual thing is a debate that will start to flare up through the 60s. But here in 62, we have a very direct statement of how the United States Congress views the growing peace movement. So the Committee for Peace, of course, has this directly in their mind, and they have a resolution. And they see what happens to the women's strike for peace and the advocacy against them. And they come up with a resolution, which really doesn't sound like a lot in 2021. We see all sorts of things where people will sign up on change.org or other ways of putting out their personal views or lending their support to particular causes all the time. But in 1962 and 63, this is a big step because the label of communist carried a great deal of weight at this time in history. So the Committee for Peace comes together and puts out a questionnaire to their membership looking at this recent document from HUAC, or Un-American Activities Committee, and they are wanting to have a statement from the committee opposing this. Well, so they send out a circular to their membership on whether or not they want to publicly support the women's strike for peace as part of this larger advocacy for pacifism and for maintaining peace. And the vote comes back 27 for and 2 against. So a very important standpoint for local citizens really engaging themselves in these very broad questions of national policy and of public advocacy on national issues. So a couple of more interesting documents that come out of this collection. So one of the items that comes up for the Committee for Peace is the question of nuclear weapons. And this is something, of course, that they're against. But being against it is not really effective in terms of advocacy. What they do is that they apply directly to the United States government, to the White House itself, on whether or not that the people of the United States support nuclear weapons testing. This is a form response. Now, the president asked me to thank you for your expression. It's doubtful that Kennedy would have ever seen the document, but it is very important symbolically that these people are involved in this type of advocacy. Another effort of the committee was to have a series of public symposiums and talks on Vietnam. As we get into 64 and particularly 65, this is becoming the hot button issue in American politics, one of 2 or 3. What the committee does is it sends word up to a Dr. James Clark. He's up at the University of Maine, and he gives a what would have been a relatively controversial speech in early 1965 that comes out against the Vietnam War. And he rests his argument on history. So this is going to be that argument of getting involved in Vietnam is a quagmire. Look what happened with the French a few years before. And this is one of the really early voices advocating for that idea of Vietnam as a war that should be avoided because it cannot be won. So, a very early voice on that, because that was not a widely held opinion outside of a few certain circles in 1965. So, this is one of the great finds in this collection. We have a record of his entire speech, and it is a very direct commentary on a national issue here on MDI. This one's interesting to me. Again, this is another form letter, but notice who it's from, the Department of State. So this Committee for Peace here on MDI was writing not only to public officials like the Office of the Presidency, but also to the State Department, particularly on the issue of Vietnam as we get into 1965. And what we see in these documents is a very interesting series of primary sources that are looking at Vietnam from the perspective of quote unquote official Washington and what the rationale behind things like the Gulf of Tonkin resolution and the arguments for escalation of the conflict. So we have our cover letter off to our left. We have really the rationale for entry into Vietnam as a reflection of the history of the 1930s. In the 1960s, that would have been very much part of the learned memory of the rise of dictatorial powers like Hitler in Europe and of the difficulties of appeasement in assisting that rise. Whether or not that is a good application of history is another question. But nonetheless, this is a very direct statement and a very direct public advocacy message that is being sent by people on MDI and this Committee for Peace, all the way up to the very highest levels of the American government. So sort of our last image, and a very provocative image in a lot of ways. One thing that a lot of younger folks do not remember about the 60s is that the military draft is still very much alive and well. So that is not abolished until 72, in part because of the moral difficulty of having a military draft in a democracy. In this image, we see a priest. Now, would Christ carry a draft card? And this reflects back to me on that initial document we started with over that really interesting group of people involved in the peace movement, not only women, but ministers. And we see that reflected here. And a very short, but in many ways very difficult question. Can a citizen choose his war? In the context of the 1960s, there is not a declaration of war. Congress does not vote on a formal declaration of war. It is rather an authorization of force. So this is going to be a question that you see more and more throughout the 1960s until it reaches a head in 1968 and 69 over whether or not the American people would support a war in Vietnam and whether or not the military draft would be supported as well. Again, these documents come from an organization that is dedicated towards peace. And they are offering us one very important aspect of the conversation of the 1960s. There are, of course, other perspectives that other collections would go into. But however, this is a very important and interesting collection because it is that public involvement in a way and in a place that you would not expect to see of MDI through the 1960s. So that brings us to the end of some of the more interesting one. These documents range through hundreds of different uh, documents that we run into. So that is just a small handful and a small selection of what we see in the collection that is donated to us. Again, fascinating to me as a historian because they're not even on Google. And this Committee for Peace does not even appear on Wikipedia. So that gives us an idea of the very rare and valuable and remarkable resource that we have here in our archives that have been donated to us. So thank you for stopping in for Chebacco Chats this week. We will meet again on Chebacco Chats in 2 weeks' time, and I look forward to seeing everybody then. So have a good rest of the day, and thank you for joining.